Welcome to today's talk on history of the town of Vashon. And this is part of the series for the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks. This is a talk in partnership with the Vashon Heritage Museum and the Senior Center. And we also want to send a thank you to our sponsor, For Culture. So please check us out online at the Vashon Heritage Museum website to learn about future talks and join our community by becoming a member of the museum and supporting us as we continue to present our history. And now I'd like to turn this over to Liz.
So I'll be handling the questions today. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. If you could put your questions in there. And I think we'll save them to the end because Brian has a pretty steady talk. But please put your questions in there and I'll put them together and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Liz. Now, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge, recognize, and honor the Shabbat Native people. We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands of the Shabbat Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was their home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers came and displaced them. This is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor the island itself and the Shabbat people, past and present. So now let's introduce our speaker, Brian Brenno. Brian Brenno is a fourth-generation islander who grew up hearing stories about Vashon from his father and grandfather, both business owners in the town of Vashon. He is the author of the recently released book, Town of Vashon, 1890 to 1960. He's the past president of the Vashon Heritage Museum, a co-curator of the 2011 exhibit Main Street Vashon, and a Vashon history buff, and the owner of Brian Brenno Glass. So Brian, what drives your interest in the town of Vashon?
Well, first of all, hearing stories from my grandpa and dad got me interested. And when I was a kid, our neighbor Sue Oliver had the O.S. Van Linde History of Vashon Island book, and I got a copy of that when I was in college, and I had been interested in history all along. And then when I curated the Main Street Vashon show, in a discussion with Bruce Holman before the show, he mentioned a question Anne Irish had posed when she was studying all the islands in Puget Sound. And her question was, why did the main town end up in the center of the island? Most islands, Puget Sound Island especially, the main town is on the water, or a port town, and Vashon's isn't. And instantly came to my mind was the paved road through town. Must have been one of the reasons. And there was a bank there, the only bank on the island. Well, my intuition after all my studies proved out pretty right. Transportation and the financial center being in the town of Vashon really drove it to be the main town. Another factor was kind of a bitter rivalry between North and South. And a lot of that had to do with because the town of Vashon had the bank and the financial center, and they were able to grow, and a lot of it was fighting over where the ferry docks came when they showed up. So that's what got me interested in. I did a lot of research, read all of the newspapers, went through all of them that they have stored, and copied every article I could find about the town of Vashon, and then compiled the timeline, and then put it all together and made this book. So that's how I got started. And then I went and I found basically 7 kind of eras that really changed the town of Vashon. And we're going to go through, this is the chapters in my book, and we're going to go through kind of each of these eras and explain what forces during those times kind of changed the island and made Vashon the main town. So it started with settlement, 1865 to 1890, and this influences were logging. They cleared land, homesteaders came, cleared land for farming. Transportation was basically by steamboat. There was just trails around the island. There was a bunch of isolated communities. And during this time, the first roads came. So we're going to talk about the factors that influenced the start of the town of Vashon before it actually became a town. One of those was logging. Matthew Bridges was one of the early loggers. He came in 1865. The Finney Logging Company had a logging track just that went from about Ober Park to where the current Harbor School is, out to the water. And they started logging in the 1870s. There's an article in the Seattle Daily Intelligencer in 1878, and they said there's 5 logging camps on Vashon. Estimated 200 million feet of good logs yet to be cut. At the present rate of cutting, it should take about 7 years to clear them off. So as we go through this, I'm going to use some quotes from back in the time, because that's one thing that excites me about doing this research, is when I read firsthand accounts and stuff. The vernacular is a little bit different. They're usually pretty gushing and promotional. And so I'm going to use some of these quotes to tell the story. And I do this a lot in the book too. So, this is one of the largest trees they found, 12 feet in diameter. This one was down by Glen Acres. So as all this land was cleared, settlers came, homesteaders, and they built a little log cabin or something and start clearing land. O.S. Van Linde related a great story about early homesteader life. He says, the family, father, mother, and a boy and 2 girls lived in a tent while the men, father and son, cleared a little patch of ground, planted a garden, built a log cabin. There were plenty of deer and grouse on the island, and Bill the son kept the family well supplied in meat. But when store grub got low, a trip to Tacoma was required. After rowing a flat-bottomed boat to Tacoma, the family bought beans, sack of flour, chunk of sow belly, some stuff to make clothes, and a little package of sugar. So in the early days, the steamboats were starting to run up and down the Sound, but not have regular stops. So these settlers would either try to flag down a steamboat going by, or row a rowboat into Seattle to get, or Tacoma to get food, because at this point there's no stores on the island. And they did a lot of family farming at first for sustenance, and later started developing farming for crops. So in 1885, just south of the Finney logging track, several homesteaders came, Livesley, Ward, Blackburn, and several others, that kind of, their homesteads encompassed the town of Vashon. Ward donated several acres to the Methodist Church, and in 1885, the settlers built this little log church. This is the first non-home building in the town of Vashon area, and it's the same property where the current Methodist Church is. So that was kind of the start. Settlers came, were farming, and farms proliferated pretty strongly in the old Finney logging area, and from the current town of Vashon off towards Bank Road to the center of the island. And the settlers in that area needed a place to catch steamboats. So they found the Finney logging operation had a base camp about a mile east of the town of Vashon. If you take Bank Road to Beale Road, instead of turning right on Beale Road, you turn left. That's Soper Road. It goes down to what was ended up being called Vashon Landing. Settlers would go there and flag down steamers. Eventually, like many other areas on the island, they built a little raft and steamers would come, and then they built docks. So the first docks were like this dock here. This one's in Tahlequah. They all floated. They were just logs with boards pounded on top of them, and people would walk out in logs to the docks. And I can just imagine these docks were slippery, slimy. Can you imagine carrying crates of strawberries out to the steamboat on a wet, cold day? I'm sure a lot of people fell in. So there's float docks until about the 1890s, when farming became even stronger. King County got involved and started building docks and roads to docks. And Vashon Landing ended up being the most important farm-to-market dock on the island. So farmers started doing strawberries and tree fruit because they would grow without irrigation. And since there's a limited water supply in Vashon, it was the best crop to grow. And so by the late 1880s, they were starting to earn a revenue by selling their crops, and they needed transportation ways to get it to steamer docks, to get it to bigger markets, because as their crops grew, they would sell them off island. The first 3 roads were established in 1883. The Blue Road is one of the first roads. It followed President Bank Road down Soper Road to the Vashon Landing. The Green Road followed the basic route of Vashon Highway now from the future town of Vashon to a steamer dock in Quartermaster Harbor. And the Red Road would be Cemetery Road and Vashon Avenue today that led down to a steamer landing at Ellisport. So that their central island farms could get their crops to the dock and off the island. So on the right-hand side, you'll see what developed. Eventually, developed a bunch of little communities around the water side, and roads began to expand. King County made roads to a lot of the docks, and that's the skeleton backbone of our roads today. So a lot of these little communities ended up, since they're all pretty isolated, before there's real roads and cars, they would develop a little post office and maybe a little store. So each little community was isolated and had its own little way to sustain itself with a store and a post office. The roads were really bad. And I like this Bill Rendell, who was a Maury Island pioneer, wrote about the roads, this one about a road on Maury Island. He said the road established in Maury Island in 1885 that led to the Lighthouse Reserve, though called the county road, for many years afterwards, this hardly justified the name, as the greater part of it was only wider than a wagon, and the slough brush hid many of the log endings to make it worse. So here's a O.S. Van Olinda photograph of the road to Vashon Landing. The first store on the island was actually built at Center. McLean and Anway built a store there, and the church was there. This is the first commercial district. The second store was started at Ellisport by Fuller, but he moved it up here to Center shortly thereafter. So Center was in the center of the island. It seemed like the place where town would start and be the main town, centrally located on a road to the steamer. But Center really never grew past being just a small community, and we'll talk about reasons for that a little bit. So the beginning of the town of Vashon really starts with the Gorsuch store, built in 1890, and it was related to the importance of traffic going to Vashon Landing past that area. And it's also important the other communities and how they developed and the competition between them and the town of Vashon. So by 1891, there was steamer service daily from Quartermaster Harbor to Tacoma on the Sophia. This is the Sophia docked at Dockton, and in the background on the hill, you can see the first building of Vashon College in Burton. So Burton had that advantage. They had daily steamer service before Vashon did. Vashon only had steamer service 3 times a week at Vashon Landing. So Miles Hatch started Burton, and it was a going concern at that time. A settler in 1890, O.S. Van Olinda relates this story. The settler said, "The pioneer days are surely behind us. The past 10 years have brought a host of settlers. We have a post office here at Quartermaster and another up at Vashon, near the center of the island. A daily boat to Tacoma, and the Iola is making regular stops every other day on the east side and alternate days on the west side. We have several miles of wagon road, and many of the farmers have teams and wagons, some difference from the old days." So this is 1890. They begin to get roads, and better steamer service. So in 1890, Frank Gorsuch bought a piece of property just south of the Gorsuch store at the intersection of Road 118, which goes north and south, Vashon Highway, and 117, which is Bank Road. Perfect example of that real estate adage, location, location, location. Because all these farmers were going by to go to the Vashon Landing to ship their stuff off the island, and it brought business right there. right past his store. Unlike modern stores of the day back then, it wasn't self-serve. You bring in the list, clerk would go get your stuff and you take it away. And the store carried all sorts of things because they had to supply everything for the settlers. So they had everything from spices, coffee, tobacco, oils, feed for livestock, hardware, kerosene, groceries, cloths, sewing supplies, clothing, on and on. So it was, these general stores had a bit of everything for everyone. And I find this interesting. R.F. Martin, an early islander, wrote of the Gorsuch store. He said, "The Gorsuch store, besides supplying the needs of the community, also served as a meeting place where friends and neighbors met to gossip and discuss various topics of interest." And, you know, that could describe Thriftway today. So at this same time, you know, there's other stores developing around. So there's a store developing at Glen Acres, Chautauqua, Docton, Burton, Liza Beulah, Cove. So there's a lot of little communities around, disconnected, isolated communities around the island. Miles Hatch started Burton in 1891 after the bridge, a high bridge, was built over the Jed Creek. He built a store, and his wife named the area Burton after her home place in England. So in 1891, Hatch got supporters together and they built the first building of the college on the hill above Burton. That's it on the left, 1892. Eventually developed into a college. And so Burton was, at that point, bigger than the town of Vashon. Out in Docton, which was very isolated, no road, didn't get road for years, it's the most isolated community. They got a dry dock around 1891 and were doing great business rebuilding ships, building ships, had over 85 employees that came by steamboat from Tacoma to work there. So Docton was another growing town on the island at the time. In 1887, the Chautauqua movement platted land north of Ellisport, and they laid out streets and lots. They built a store, a post office, a dock. They would, and so it was started as a little town too. So to further solidify the town, in this era, farming grew, and more businesses came to town. The bank came to town, which was really important. And the first cars came, which the change in transportation would change the character of the whole island from isolated little communities to more of a connected whole. So in 1903, Ari Ernest came to visit his friend Steve Harmling on Vashon, and he was impressed with the fact that all these strawberries could be grown with no irrigation, and he moved his family to Vashon. They started a farm on the present day Island Lumber property. That's Ari Ernest standing there. People have heard of Fred Ernest, that's him kneeling in the front. So they started farming. And the Ernesties were important starting churches on the island. At first, they sold a lot to the YMCA right there on the main highway where Camp Colvis is now. The YMCA built a huge building there. And it's interesting because Francis Bilnick, a long-time islander, recalled that the large YMCA building was built in 1904 to house Presbyterian services and community functions. It was a local group, not part of the national organization. Oddly, it was seldom, if ever, used for Y activities. So it was more of a community center and the first home of the Presbyterian Church. 4 years later, Ernest sold another piece of property just south of the YMCA building, and the current Presbyterian Church was built there. So this Presbyterian Church was the second church in town. The Methodist Church, Log Church, was the first. Shortly after the Presbyterian Church was built, the Methodists built the church that's there now on their property. So this picture shows the town of Vashon around the time, around 1908. Looking north from the Presbyterian Church, you see it on the right, and then the next building you see is that YMCA building, and that's on the property that Camp Colvis is on right now. I'm not going to talk about the other buildings right now in the background because they come up next. Well, actually, I will. That big building you see there that says hotel on it was built by R.F. Martin. He bought 3 lots in 1908 and built this building and held his real estate office, another little office, a dining room, and on the top floor was a 6-room hotel. This was referred to as the Martin Block building. In 1906, Nels Peterson built a meat market on the corner of Bank Road and the main road. So now town was growing. You had a bunch of growth coming. And next, big 1905, strawberry farmers were producing so much they formed an association to ship berries to eastern markets. They loaded railroad cars on barges, barges, and brought them to Vashon Landing and loaded them and took them to Seattle for processing. Around there, they load like 2 cars a day. I think they said there's 16,000 strawberry crates shipped in 1905. So Vashon Landing was really booming. There's a lot going on there, a lot of shipping on action. This is town looking south from Bank Road. If you, on the far left, just out of the picture would have been the Peterson Meat Market. The first building you see there was a Stephenson store. It was built in 1905. It was a saddle, shoe, and harness shop, and the other half was the post office. Just past that building was the telephone office. Telephone came in 1903. It was pretty shaky because in the beginning it was just no lines were strung on trees. By 1910, I think Vashon Islanders took over the phone. And then you can see the Martin Block building with hotel on it and the Presbyterian Church. On the right side, you see the Gorsuch store. Then there was the Gorsuch orchard and property. So in 1908, the Masons built a Mason Hall, and they had a clubhouse upstairs. And in 1909, Vashon State Bank opened. Now, Vashon State Bank was opened and created by Islanders, run by Islanders, and this is one of the main reasons that it became the main town. Number one, the customers would come there to town because it was the only bank. And number two, the bank proved to be the biggest financer and booster of the town of Vashon, giving business loans and helping develop properties. So having the bank in town pretty much set the course for Vashon becoming the main town. And then cars came around 1907. This is E.E. Van Olinda and his little brush. They'd strap the cars onto a steamer at first and bring them over and bring them on the island. And of course, the roads were horrible. They're steep, narrow, weaved around stumps and boulders and rutted. It was just a mess. But cars would eventually really change the island. And here's a cute story. Fred Ernestine was there when Van Olinda brought his car up for Vashon Landing, which was a steep hill out of the landing. So he says, I well remember when E.E. Van Olinda took delivery on the Vashon dock of his brush car. The car rolled nicely along the dock and climbed up the first gentle slopes. But when it hit a steeper grade, it would stall, then roar a few feet, and then slip back as it ran out of momentum. There are a number of us kids watching, and he got us to put blocks behind the wheels as the car gained a few feet. It took hours to get it uptown. So that's kind of, the first cars encountered a lot of troubles on the roads. This road is the road that went to the Melita dock around 1909 on Maury Island. You can see how rutted and potentially muddy and yucky it is. So by 1909, there's, in the town of Vashon, there's a bank, general store, meat market, blacksmith, shoe, saddle, and harness shop, post office, newspaper office, telephone office, hotel, real estate office, school, and 2 churches. By far the largest town on Vashon. And the opening of the bank, like I said, was really important to sustaining the town of Vashon as the main town. So in this era, in the modern era, the town got electricity. The first that was a tongue twister, the first car ferry came and the first paved roads came. So the introduction of cars helped improve and expand roads, and it kind of helped consolidate the island. Before, there had always been kind of a competition between the south end and the north end of the island. And over the years, it was referred to as the Mason-Dixon line, because those south of like Cemetery Road and those north of Cemetery Road were like competing for transportation and businesses. As ferries came, they would fight for where the ferry dock would be. So, you know, Olinda called it a hateful rivalry, and at times it was. And it was all competition basically to see who would be the prominent business center, the prominent part of the island. And with the introduction of cars, Olinda said, exactly in the proportion as transportation facilities improved, the feeling of hateful rivalry decreased. Good roads helped, the automobile was the most powerful influence, and the telephone helped too. So the changes, being able to have better transportation kind of brought the island together and started consolidating it. Vashon Landing, here you see this picture of Vashon Landing in around 1910. It had a store at the dock, and for a while on the right-hand side, that was a mill. It later became a cannery. Like I said, the business through Vashon Landing really helped fuel the growth of the town of Vashon. This is looking north from Bank Road in 1916 of the Vashon State Bank, built a new bank, the site of the current US Bank in 1912. You see it there on the left. And if you look north from town, you notice there's no buildings. There was no business buildings north of Bank Road. Town was centered right there south of Bank Road. If you look at this picture, the third telephone on the right, you see a building. That was the Island Club building. It used to be a school, the first big school in the town of Vashon. And that's the Ober Park property. So you can see at this point, town had not grown north of Bank Road. So 1916, the first ferry came. And the first ferry actually went from Portage to Des Moines. And this is really beneficial for those south of the Mason-Dixon line, and especially Maury Island, where mining, milling industries and a dairy industry had developed due to the ferry, access to the ferry. So the guys in north of Mason-Dixon line, sorry that was loud, north of Mason-Dixon line kept agitating for ferry service north of the line. And Bill Rendell, who was a Maury Islander, wrote about that. He said, these men had determined in their own minds there was only two possible routes that would be accepted for the ferry, both having their terminal at Vashon Landing. They fought the establishment of the ferry route at Portage, even though at elections held twice, the route had won out. Well, after agitating in 1919, a route was developed from Heights to Harper, which is north of Southworth, to downtown Seattle, the forerunner of our current triangular route. And as that gained acceptance and importance, by 1920, the Portage run was closed. 1921, the route from Tahlequah to Tacoma was built. And this pretty much ended the steamer era. So all these little docks and little communities started to fade as the transportation points became at the end of the islands. Now, at this point, Vashon and Burton had kind of an equal chance of being the main town because both were on the route to the ferries. And Vashon actually won out, and Burton, Miles Hatch, who was the main investor and promoter of Burton, left in 1906. In 1912, one of the buildings of the college burnt, and eventually the college closed. So by 1912, Burton's on the downswing. By the 1920s, it had come back, but Burton didn't have the financial investors or business investors the town of Vashon did, the bank and the businesses that built there. So Burton never really caught up to Vashon after that. So in 1921, they paved the first road on the island, and this was actually the first paved road on Puget Sound Island. It went from the Heights Ferry Dock to Center. My grandpa, they had just built a house on the old highway, and he remembers going and playing on the paving equipment. So this had a big effect on the growth of Vashon because all that traffic would go through town, and there would be business. There was businesses there. From 1921 on, a lot of business development went on. The planning of business property, the old Gorsuch property, into business lots. The town got a water system allowing it to expand, and 6 new buildings were built in this era. The first one was the Detmont building. You know it as the bar area of the Red Bike Tavern. This building was house, garage, a feed and hay store, and many businesses. 1938, the tavern moved in, and there's been a tavern in this building consistently since 1938. In 1922, Beal and Hansen bought the Gorsuch property and platted it into business lots. And you can see along Vashon Highway on the right-hand side, the Gorsuch store was first, and then these other properties got buildings. By 1930, all of them except one had businesses on. So this really boosted the amount of businesses in the town of Vashon. The first one to be built was the C.F. Van Olinda building, current home to Solo Mio and Pollard Coffee. So the post office moved out of the Stephenson store into this new modern building, and soda fountain and candy shop started in the other half of the building. This building, remember the Masonic Hall building with the Vashon State Bank? It was a 2-story brick building. Well, after the bank moved out, there was a fire after a storm, and the top half was damaged. So in 1922, Ed Mace bought the building and took off the 2nd floor. He expanded the building to the south and remodeled it and made it bigger and turned it into a garage. So if you look at this picture, the right-hand side, that's where the creamery is now, and oh, pardon me, left-hand side. And the right is where Paper Chase and the Lease Gallery are. So they removed that 2nd floor in 1922. 1926, the water system came to town. They pumped water from Beal Creek to this storage tank that stood in the center of Vashon on the water company property by the Little House until the late 70s. This allowed the town to have water and to grow and to keep fire insurance rates reasonable. 1927, Garner Kimmel built the first brick store building on the island. He had been in business with Axel Peterson in the Peterson store, which used to be the Stephenson store. You can see it on the right of this picture. It was an old 2-story storefront building. 27, he removed the Peterson Meat Market, which had been where his new store is, and built this modern brick grocery store, or well, not a grocery store, more a general store. So in 1928, England and Peterson was a lumber and feed and hay company started by Axel Peterson, and he went in partnership with England, and they also ran Vashon Auto Freight, which is the trucks out front. These 2 buildings were built in 1928 on that Gorsuch Addition property. If you look to the far right, you see another building with a sign on it. That's the Beal Hansen building, built by Beal and Hansen, and it had a little store and a couple other businesses in it. 28, the YMCA building was expanded. They put on this front addition for a theater. They put in a balcony and concession stand and bathrooms, and remodeled the building for theater. And it was the Islands Theater for a long time. 1928, Weiss, who had taken over the old Gorsuch store, built a new store building. You know this building now as the Ruby Brink. With this new store, it was more modern, and it was a store where customers could self-serve. refrigerator cases were brought in and lower counters, and it was the first real kind of self-serve grocery store on the island. This picture shows looking north from just about in front of Camp Colvis in 1930. So this is how town looked. On the right-hand side, you see the Island Theater building, the old YMCA building. In 1928, this next building was the Metro Garage, built by L.C. Beale and leased to the Metro Garage. And then the next building down would be the Martin Block building. On the other side, you see the Vashon Garage, England Peterson. Past that is the Beale Hansen building, and at the end of the block, the hardware store. Oh, I didn't mention that. After Weiss moved his store out of the hardware store building, Kimmel's moved their hardware department across the street to the old Gorsuch store. So in 1933, the town was rocked by a fire. So that really impacted the town. And around this time, town really consolidated around the town of Vashon. So Charles Detman, C.F. Van Linde, Garner Kimmel, Beale Hansen, and T.M. Thompson all built business buildings that they leased to other businesses. Portage was no longer a transit point for off-island travel. Dockton had a thriving fishing and farming community, but it still had a challenging road and was isolated. Burton was no longer steamboat transportation. The brick industry and college were gone. Hatch was gone. It never developed further. Center was the crossroads and the most central part of the island, but never developed further, probably because they didn't have that ability to have people invest in businesses there. So the fire in 1933 started in the Martin Block building, kind of in back of it where there's a bus garage. It burnt the Martin building, which is behind where these four guys are standing on the right. That wall you see behind them is the south wall of the Red Bikes bar area. It stopped the fire from traveling to the other buildings down at the end of the block. On the far right, you see the remains of the Metro Garage after it burnt down. Those buildings were on fire, and the fire was hot. It jumped across the street and burnt down the England Peterson buildings, where it was lumber, hay, and stuff storage. It just, poof. It damaged the Vashon Garage. It burnt down the Beale Hansen building all the way to that white wall you see is Van Linde building where a Solo Neo Pizza and stuff is now. The town was quickly rebuilt. The news, Vashon Island News Record reported, like a proverbial ill wind, the fire of April 17th has put at least 20 men to work, and more will be at work before the end of the week. The sound of cement mixers can be heard in both directions as concrete is being poured for foundations of England Peterson, Metro Garage, and the new Beale Hansen building. Excavating for the England Peterson building started Tuesday with the remains of the former building still burning. I love that line. The way Vashon is recovering from a fire that would spell ruin to many communities is truly remarkable. Well, it was. Most of the buildings were rebuilt within 60 days. This is the rebuilt daily needs market. And this building burnt again in 1977 and was replaced by the current pharmacy building. This is the replaced Metro Garage. This garage was built, I'm gonna call it True Value Hardware, but I know that it's Ace now. So if you're standing on Vashon Highway looking towards Thriftway, you would see this. Instead of the Ace Hardware building, this building was right there. There's a little gas station in front and a big garage behind. This is the old Stephenson store, Kimmel store building in 1936. George McCormick and Elmer Harmley started the beloved Alibi restaurant in Vashon. It was a restaurant for many years, had many different owners. McCormick explained how he started. I thought this was a good story. I was working in Vashon and didn't like to carry my lunch. So I went to a local tea room, as that's all there was. One day, I thought my serving called for a little something else. When I asked for it, I was given a small muffin and charged an extra 10 cents. In those days, 10 cents was 10 cents. When I objected to the extra cost but got no results, I thought to myself, I'll start my own restaurant. Elmer Harmony and I got together and took over the old Steffenson store building and made it into a restaurant. As I said, this is a loved Vashon restaurant for many years. In 1934, Fred Stevenson built a shell station on the old Metro Garage property that had burned down. If you look at the far right, you see the wall of the old Metro Garage. And then on the left, you see the bathroom for the gas station. And then on the far left, that's the wall of what would be now the bar area of the Red Bike. So that lot was still vacant between the Red Bike and from the Martin Block building. 1937, my grandfather bought the station and ran that business for many years. 1940, Kimmel's expanded into like the Weiss store into a self-serve store. They basically doubled their square footage. The news record of Vashon on the news record reported. In 1927, the present store at Vashon, belonging to C.J. Kimmel, opened for business in a modern building that was entirely adequate for a stock of general merchandise and the latest word in every respect. It was not many years until an addition for storage was necessary. A short time later, the hardware department was crowded out and the Vashon Hardware Company started across the street in the Gorsuch store. Still another addition was built to house a modern locker system, which quickly proved to be an answer to the need of rural community where much food is raised. So this is a frozen locker storage system. Less than 2 months ago, another addition was necessary to take care of increasing business. Although this involved moving the 2-story building occupied by the Alibi and the office building adjoining the Kimmel store, both were moved 30 feet to the south. This was speedily accomplished. An addition which approximately doubled the floor space is now added. So this is basically, you know, beginning the second, I think, Weiss store across the street and Kimmel's store were in big competition now to be the most advanced. Kimmel's brought in all new refrigerated cases of cheese and dairy, and frozen foods renew. So this is a big addition to town. In 1940, George McCormick bought out Kimmel's interest in the Vashon Hardware Company. He added this what you see up there, the current storefront, and added a loading dock and a warehouse in the back. In 1940, my grandpa remodeled the old Stevenson's Shell station, and Lloyd Robb built auto sales shop. So if you look on the left, you see the white storefront that kind of sticks up. That is the current day dance floor area of the Red Bike, and that was the building that Lloyd Robb built. And then where it's right next to it to the right, where there's a dark area, that's where Spider Sports would be now. And then at the end where it says Service and Shell, that would be where Giraffe is. So Rob and my grandfather put in a continuous cement floor over the whole property and built a firewall between the Rob building and the auto repair shop. In the 40s, town started to expand north of Bank Road. Gus Backus, who built Backus Lumber north of Bank Road in 1926, was basically the force behind it all. He built the white building you see on the right, which today is a Vashon Baking Company. He built that, and the Shirley Shop, a woman's apparel shop, opened it in 1940. The next building, the black one, he built in 1945. He leased that to Holder Electric and Home Bakery. He expanded his lumber store, and then on the north side of his lumber store in 1948, he built another building that housed Puget Power and later the newspaper. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 businesses that were able to be in business through Backus providing the buildings. Really helped the town grow in the mid to late 40s. So during this time, the end of World War II, you know, there's a big change from telephones to electricity to cars and ferries that really changed the island and changed it from a scattered group of isolated communities into kind of a unified whole. small community centers like Quartermaster, Burton, Portage, Stockton, Lesbula, Chautauqua, Glen Acres, Cove, and Clovis, with stores, post office, and churches, became more neighborhoods of the whole community. And the business center consolidated in the town of Vashon. Post offices closed one by one in the little neighborhoods, and eventually the stores, leaving today only the Harbor Mercantile is only the last little community store. So after the war, business growth accelerated. The state ferry system came, making it easy for islanders to become commuters and a new class of the population. Modernization really hit in the grocery stores and other stores, and the waterside communities began to disappear as stores and post office. 1946, the old YMCA building theater burnt down. In 1947, they built a new one. This was a modern, the one we have now with a slanted floor. It had air conditioning, seating for 500, really new, modern addition to town. 46 also brought a library. King County made a library system. They provided books and salary for a librarian, and the communities paid for the building and the property. This was now the senior center was the library. It was dedicated to the dead from World War II and built with community donations. 1949, a bowling alley came, and this is unique because Marie Mickle and Chris Remy, women, were said to be the first women owners of a bowling alley ever by an article in the Seattle paper. It brings up a point that I'd like to follow up a little bit more, is that there's a lot of women businesses, run businesses on Vashon over the years. This is what today would be the copy shop and gravy. Carl Hollert, who owned the property, tore down the old England Peterson sheds and built this property in contract with the government for a post office. Dairy Queen came, this is where Island Queen is, in 1954. Instantly became a great kids hangout over the years. Robinson Furniture was built in 55 in what is now the Voice of Vashon. And this is Kimmel's. So in 55, Kimmel's really became a supermarket. They expanded, they took out their old office building that was between it and the Alibi restaurant and expanded the store, really modernized it into more like a supermarket. The Alibi building right after that was torn down and remodeled, and this was the new Alibi building today where Kronos is. My grandfather in 1955 built the Shell station where the Camp Colvis is housed in now. And also in 1955, the community came together through the Kiwanis Club, and volunteers built this youth center at present-day Open Park. And to end out the 50s, Kimmel's built a brand new store, the first business really west of the main highway. This was a big deal and a really step forward in modernization because of all the frills of a modern store. Carl Hollert moved his Vashon Lumber and Supply from the old England Peterson building to this building behind Chevron in the 60s. The bank was torn down in 1960 and the current US Bank building built. And that kind of ends out that era. And after that, Vashon is definitely the main town. And that pretty much ends my presentation, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm open to answering questions now.
Great. That was fantastic, Brian. As a relative newcomer, you can see that a lot of sweat and blood and tears went into this community, and we know the heart of the community that exists now, but just to see that endeavor and that industry over 130 years is just remarkable.
Yeah.
So we have a question about current day, and you did pretty well bringing us up to date about what businesses were in what what historic buildings, but Liza Bull is interested in the oldest buildings in Vashon, and so is the Presbyterian Church the oldest building on Main Street?
The oldest building on Vashon is a hardware store restaurant built in 1890. It's the Gorsuch store. Another old building would be the Presbyterian Church, 1908. The Methodist Church, 1909. Those are the three that come to the top of my head. I think there's a couple others that are 100 years old, but or over 100. But yeah, the first one was the hardware store restaurant. 130 years that building stand on the corner.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so we have another question from early on, and this is from Cliff Marks. He wants to know, so how, given this was stolen land, how was ownership established for the first settlers? How was that township established, and how did people divvy up the land?
So first homesteaders came and homesteaded the land, and then once they had proved their homestead, they were able to sell the land to other people. So 1864, I believe, is when the Homestead Act came from the US government, still basically stealing the land from the natives, but with the blessing of the United States government, as far as I can. So yeah, it was the Homestead Act that brought homesteaders, and then once they proved their homestead, they sold to other people.
Okay, well, I urge people to put their questions in the Q&A at the bottom, and so we have a couple more. So somebody wants to know, when did Thriftway get built?
Thriftway got built in 1961 or 62, just slightly out of my era that I reported on. I reported on it in my book, 61, I think.
Great. And now we have a question from Josephine Hutton. She wants to know about the forests on Vashon. She says almost all the forests on Vashon are new growth from that date when 100 years ago, and there's not many old growth trees left. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. If you remember my first quote from the Seattle newspaper, they said there's 200 million feet of board logs, and they hope to wipe it out in 7 years. Quite a cavalier attitude towards the forest, but that's how they felt. It was there for the taking.
Yeah.
I walk all over this island on the trails, and I find huge stumps. Huge. The last one we saw was probably, almost 10 feet in diameter. If you walk, and especially if you bushwalk, and Fern Cove, Shingle Mill area, there's so many huge old stumps, and some 150-year-old trees. But no old growth. Yeah, it's all gone.
Wow. So people want to know about the roads, and particularly, when did they connect Vashon to Maury? When did that road go through? And
that's really kind of murky. Around 1890, they began filling it in, and people have this impression that it was like a really detached. But if you go down there, if you're ever down there, just get out of your car and walk around. If you look north of the portage store, you'll see a big swampy area. And that's basically what it was. At low tide, it was a big swampy area. At high tide, it would fill in. Bill Rendell, who was a settler in the 1800s, said that it was maybe 30 feet across at high tide. And not really deep enough for big boats. So I believe it was around the 1890s when they started filling it in.
Okay. And you mentioned a Mason-Dixon line earlier.
Yeah, I explain that a lot better in my book. It's basically people south in Burton and south of Cemetery Road, and people north. I think it was mainly the people in the south that were jealous of the development in Vashon, and perhaps the bank wasn't so helpful in financing things outside of Vashon, or these guys, the Vashon guys, seem pushy. But if you go through history from way back up until, like Anna Linda said, cars and ferries and Island Unified, there was some tension and competition between the north and south of who's going to have the ferry route and who's going to have the stores. And that kind of stuff.
Mhm. So somebody wants to know what happened to the college. Are there any?
College, there was a fire, burnt one of the buildings in 1912. I think there was a bankruptcy after that, and it just kind of, there's 2 more fires, the buildings burnt, and it just kind of disappeared. I don't know the whole history, but I know there's other fires, and eventually by the 20s it was.
Okay, so somebody here, Larry Trotter, remembers the dime store and a name like Sprouse Reed.
Yeah, Sprouts Ritz was built next to the new Kimmel store. So Sprouts Ritz would be where Granny's is, yeah, and the south part of Granny's was a bowling alley. So yeah, it was right next to. Before that, there was variety stores on the main road. Next to the building that was next to the pharmacy was a variety store like that for many years.
Great.
I think Sprouts Ritz came in 65.
So here's another question. I'm sorry, I missed this about the college. Is there anything that replaced the college?
No. One and done. Though it's interesting, the college is a pretty big thing. They even played the University of Washington in football at one point. I think it became a military college, and it was a college, kind of high school for a while, but it just faded.
I'm sure Bruce has a story.
Yeah, Bruce probably knows more about it than I do.
We'll get him back for another round on that one. So Jana wants to know what happened to the bowling alley.
Bowling alley is now Doug's Auto Repair. In the 60s, they closed, and in the early 70s, a new bowling alley opened next to the new Kimmel store where Granny's is now. So, and then that closed, I think, in the early 90s. So there's bowling in 2 separate places over the years.
Okay. Somebody wants to know, did we have a brickworks here or just a quarry for the clay?
Oh my gosh, there was more. There was lots of brickworks. There was a brickworks down by the Vashon Landing. There was around the island. When the town of Seattle burnt in 1889, 1890, whatever that was, a lot of the bricks came from Vashon. There was brickyards would work for a while. There's some in Burton, Quartermaster Harbor, kind of all around the island until they ran out of clay and they'd move on. And so, yeah, until about 1900, there was brickworks around the island.
Okay, and now this looks like a plant. Who were the first permanent settlers on Vashon? I assume.
Well, according to most sources, the Sherman family in 1877. Though Matthew Bridges was here before them, but he didn't have a family. He married a native woman. He was not a homesteader. He was an itinerant logger, so he's not considered. Most people consider the Sherman family and their party that came with them, relatives and friends, that settled the Quartermaster area as the first settlers. Hi, Jim.
Okay, so, oh yeah, this is a good question. You probably said it earlier, but where were you talking about when you say Vashon Landing?
Vashon Landing. So if you're in your car and you're heading east on Bank Road, you go past Island Lumber, you get to that 90-degree corner that takes you south on Beale Road. Instead, you turn left. And that is called Soper Road. It led down to the Vashon Landing. Now, if you take that in your car and you go to where the road kind of stops, there's a trail that leads you on the old road that went from the Dilworth kind of area. So if you go past here, go past the water treatment plant up by Ober Park, and you get to the corner, and on the corner, park your car, and there's a trail system in there that follows the old road to Vashon Landing. It's a great trail. It's on private property. It's accessible. You're allowed to go there. Go check it out. It's pretty cool.
Hey, thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
You just said it all. The only thing I'd like to add, along with thanks, is that Our next talk will be May 22nd. Bruce Holman is going to talk about the Vashon Bridge. Did you know we had one? We don't, but
Almost.
almost. So thank you, Liz, and the Senior Center. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you guys.
We're over now.
See y'all.